Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second program meeting of our season. This is our second hybrid meeting, so please excuse us as we work through the technology. Can everyone hear me on Zoom?
Yes.
Yes.
We had a problem last month. The Zoom attendees could not hear the audience here, so we've tried to make some adjustments and are speaking closer to the camera. Tonight, we're presenting Everything But Gray, the life of Audley Dean Nicols. Most of us who are here tonight recognize this artist for his infamous work of the Sewickley Bridge poster, which has become the symbol of the Historical Society, as well as the borough of Sewickley. Tonight, we're going to explore his life and look at this wonderful new book, Everything But Gray, with Gayle and Tom Duke, the authors and collectors of Nicols' paintings. I think it's a remarkable story, and I'd like to introduce our speakers for their introduction and their bios.
Real quickly, everyone on Zoom, please mute yourself and turn your video off. We can see you on the side. And just welcome everyone. A brief thing from myself. I first talked to Gayle in the summer of 2020. So this has been a year and a half in the making of this presentation and the book coming out. So I'm really excited to see the presentation. And I'm going to pass it over to them now.
Is that my cue, Amanda?
That is your cue.
All right. My name is Thomas Duke, and I'm talking to you from Northfield, Michigan. And about 20 years ago, I broke ground on a second home on top of Seguito Mountain in Tucson, Arizona. I was very familiar with Tucson as I rock climbed there often in the wintertime. Southern Arizona is an ideal winter destination for a climber. I love the remote, the lonely, the difficult locations of many of the climbs, as well as the warmth and the sunsets in these canyons and the peaks. And if you can ever visit Tucson, drive up the Catalina Highway, 25 miles to the top of Mount Lemmon to 9,000 feet, and you will have seen more granite walls and towers than you could climb in a lifetime. That same year, my wife and I, we took a trip to London, England, and stayed in the Mayfair district, which have lots of nice shops and art galleries. On a beautiful afternoon, we walked by a gallery called Eaton Gallery, with its large front door standing wide open. And I looked in as we walked by, and dead center on the wall of the first room as we entered was a small desert mountain scene that simply glowed. We walked in and recognized Southern Arizona immediately, but not the artist's name, Audley Dean Nicols. The gallery knew nothing of him. Once back home, I started talking to art dealers I knew and came up with nothing. Online information, as long as 20 years ago, was very, very sparse, and I found only 2 or 3 poor images of Nicols' other work. But I called Eaton and bought the painting anyway, having faith that I could learn more about Nicols in time. So in the coming years, I learned that there were a handful of art dealers in Texas that knew Nicols well and sold his Texas scenes to collectors and museums there. They had few buyers for his Arizona scenes, so I think I got some good buys. Fast forward again about 2 years ago, and I have 18 Nicols hanging in my home. And I have been to several of the locations where Nicols painted. Still, the information on Nicols online is amazingly sparse, and various sources contradict one another. And I felt it was time to do something to give proper credit to this great landscape artist by doing a book. I knew there were other collectors who might contribute images, as well as art dealers in several museums who had his paintings. But I needed a writer and a meticulous detective for detail to make this work. And I didn't need to think too hard on it, as my lifelong friend, Gayle, who had already authored 2 wonderful books, might be someone I could convince to help. Thankfully, she said yes, and what a wonderful job she has done. So here is the final prototype of the book, and we're ready to go to print. I've just found 2 more Nicols that I'd love to include if I could get the images within the next week or so, but we'll go to print and have these available as of Christmas. So with no further ado, Gayle, you're the star of the show, and I'll let you take over.
Yeah, well, thank you. Welcome, everybody. As Tom said, I'm a freelance writer, and I'm very grateful to him, to Tom, for the opportunity to piece together a kind of mosaic portrait of a remarkable artist who was born and formed for the first 43 years of his life right there in Sewickley. I also have to say at the outset that I'm immensely grateful to Amanda. Your director unearthed troves of artifacts and information on Nicols, most of it unseen outside Sewickley until now. And this book would not be what it is without Amanda Schaefer. So thank you to Amanda. I compare writing this biography to piecing together a mosaic because, as Tom said, when we began, most of the information on Nicols out there was just in bits and pieces, many of them contradictory to one another. For example, we found out that Nicols left Sewickley for El Paso in 1919, 1921, 1922, and 1928. Sources said all of those things. So it was up to us to take the odd scattered pieces that we found and put together a coherent picture of this artist's life. Audley Dean Nicols lived an intriguing life, and he created paintings that changed the course of art in the Southwest. In Everything But Gray, The Life of Audley Dean Nicols, we're pleased to present the largest assemblage of Nicols paintings ever seen, and also the first documented biography of his life. As Tom said, tonight we'll be presenting an abbreviated version of his story, and the book itself will be available by Christmas. It can be pre-ordered now at thelifeofaudleydeannicols.com, our website. We'll provide the link to that website again at the end of the presentation tonight. And it's also on the Sewickley Valley Historical Society website. Well, the life of Audley Dean Nicols began in this house at the corner of Beaver and Straight Streets in Sewickley. The stately brick home was built in 1850 by Nicols' maternal grandfather, John McLaughlin. McLaughlin and his wife raised 3 daughters there, including Elizabeth, who is better known as Lizzie. In 1874, in this house, Lizzie married Partial Nicols, and the house became the couple's home. That house was a landmark, by the way, in Sewickley for more than 100 years until it was torn down in the 1950s to make way for the Bell Telephone Company building. So I'll bet a number of you in the room may remember the McLaughlin house as it was known. Well, on September 22, 1875, Partial and Lizzie Nicols welcomed their first child, Audley Dean. 5 more children followed, so it was a busy household, but somehow in all that busyness, Lizzie found time to give her oldest son drawing lessons. It was no wonder that she recognized his talent because she herself was an accomplished draftswoman and painter. Before marrying, she studied with this man, George Hetzel. This is his self-portrait. He was a well-known landscape painter in Pittsburgh. And then once she finished studying with him, she actually taught drawing and painting at the Steubenville Seminary in Steubenville, Ohio. She then went on to help found the Pittsburgh School of Design, which was the forerunner of the Pittsburgh Art Society. So an accomplished artist in her own right. We don't know how seriously mother and son took their art lessons at first, but an illness that struck young Audley made it clear that his art training was going to be crucial. Sometime in his youth, and we don't know exactly when, Audley contracted extrapulmonary tuberculosis. That was TB that affected not his lungs, but in his case, the bones of his legs and his hips. This handicapped his legs for the rest of his life so that he had to use a cane. And it just in general, his health was described as delicate. Any physically strenuous work was going to be out of the question for Audley Nicols. But it seemed that art could be his path to independence. In fact, as a young man, he told the Pittsburgh Leader newspaper, "I couldn't do much else, so I studied art." Though not physically robust, Audley was able to go to school, and he graduated with 18 others from Sewickley High School in 1893. He then, in his own words, turned himself toward illustrating. Now, this was in the day before photographic reproduction. Magazine publishers couldn't rely on photographs, so instead they relied on artists to supply them line drawings for their articles. After magazine editors accepted a few of his illustrations, Nicols went to New York City to study in this building at the Art Students League. Within 2 years, he was working as an illustrator for magazines like Harper's Magazine and The Century. And he was being included in salons and parties around the city with famous illustrator guests like Charles Dana Gibson, who was the creator of the iconic Gibson Girl, and Howard Chandler Christie. So the young artist's career seemed off to a strong start. But then his always delicate health broke down completely. About 1900, he went back home to Sewickley to recover. According to an article in the Pittsburgh Leader, Nicols tried, and this is a quote, traveling for some time in search of health, but returned home in such a condition that he was compelled to undergo a severe surgical operation. What that operation was, we don't know. We do know that his recovery was slow. By the time he was modestly healthy again, he had been away from New York City and all illustrating work for 3 years. During his long, slow recovery in his parents' house in Sewickley, Nicols told a newspaper reporter that he started to work a little with colors. Now, in his telling of the story, even though he'd studied in New York with famous painters, and even though his mother was an accomplished painter, he didn't even know how to arrange colors on a palette, which seems curious, but nonetheless, that's the way he told the story. During that interview with the reporter, he showed the reporter one of his most recent oil paintings, this portrait of his sister Alice. And he told the reporter that he planned to dedicate himself thenceforth to painting. Now, this was not only because he enjoyed painting, though I trust he did. It was also because the demand for his illustrations, like this one that he made for Collier's magazine called The Yachting Girl, the demand for his illustrations was declining because the halftone engraving process was being perfected. And that process allowed magazines to use photographs rather than illustrations, rather than drawings for their articles. Nicols was a practical young man, and so he was going to adapt his talent to the times. Sewickley, in 1900, when Nicols returned home to recover, had a population of 3,600. It just couldn't offer Nicols the kind of artistic exposure as a painter that he could have found by returning to New York City or even going to Pittsburgh to set up a studio. His father had an office in Pittsburgh and he could have gone there. But there were other benefits to him to settling in Sewickley. The Leader reporter, the newspaper reporter, wrote, Nicols has always been a popular member of the younger Sewickley social set. Residents characterize Nicols as having a singular, friendly charm. Nicols chose the quiet comforts of a small town, surrounded by family and friends, over the stimulation of an urban art hub. And he was busy socially in Sewickley. He put his talents to work for local causes for almost 2 decades. His youngest brother, Lowell, was an active member of something called the Cot Club. That was an amateur theater group that raised money for the local hospital and other charity causes. For the Cot Club and other groups in town, Nicols designed playbills, posters, programs like this one, and scenery. Deciding to settle in Sewickley, he set up a painting studio in a corner of the Sewickley Trust building. And in that studio, he worked at refining his painting skills. He was able to interest magazine in his paintings for their covers. This painting, for example, appeared on the cover of the Burr Mackintosh Monthly in 1903, and this one on the cover of Collier's magazine, its fiction issue in May of 1904. viewing one of Nicols' paintings in a shop window in 1904, perhaps this painting, the one he made for the cover of Collier's, a reporter for the Sewickley Herald wrote, "The artist's talent and inspiration have placed him in the front rank of the cult of the brush and palette." Well, as it turns out, that wasn't just local pride speaking. In that same year, 1904, Nicols' painting, A Reverie, was accepted for the 9th annual Carnegie International Exhibition, mounted by the Carnegie Institute in Pittsburgh. Though we've tried, we've not found that painting, the one that was accepted into this exhibition. And Nicols didn't win any awards or honors for that painting, but it was an honor for him just to be included in the exhibition, which included such international masters as James McNeill Whistler, Childe Hassam, and Winslow Homer. The following year, Nicols submitted another painting to the Carnegie exhibition, The Fortune Teller. But that year, his painting, this one, was not accepted for the exhibition. By the way, according to Nicols' grandson, Kent Morrison, Nicols himself is one of the two men in this painting. He didn't know which one. And Nicols' sisters posed as models for two of the women. Whether there was actually a fortune teller in Sewickley in 1905, we don't know. Nicols tried one more time to be included in the Carnegie exhibitions. He entered in 1908, but the painting he entered that year was denied too. It seemed that he was not going to find fame in elite fine art circles. Locally, however, in Sewickley, Nicols' artistic fame rose in 1910. Sewickley Civil War veteran David Shields commissioned Nicols to make a painting of his most vivid war memory, the day after Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, when Shields, as a 19-year-old aide to General Alexander Hayes, rode with the general down the cheering lines of their company, dragging Confederate flags in the dust. Nicols titled the painting that he was commissioned to make Victory. Now, the original painting has been lost. Shields' daughter-in-law gave it away after Shields died, and it hasn't been seen since. This is the best copy that the Historical Society has. It's a photograph of a print of the original painting. But the newspaper reported that the painting itself found favor among the patriot fever of the times. It also found favor with General Hayes's family. The following year, 1911, they commissioned Nicols to paint a nearly life-size portrait of the general from a photograph taken just before Hayes was killed at the Battle of the Wilderness. The Hayes family then donated the portrait of the general in 1911 to the newly built Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall and Museum in Pittsburgh. So Nicols' artistic reputation was growing locally, but it positively soared that same year, 1911. That year, according to the Sewickley Herald, Nicols painted a place for himself forever in the affections of Sewickley. That was because September 1911 marked the opening of an engineering marvel of the day. It was a cantilevered bridge connecting Sewickley and Coraopolis. Work had begun in July of 1909, and it was completed in September 1911. The two towns held a week-long celebration to mark the bridge's opening. These are pictures of the celebratory parade that happened across the bridge that year in September 1911. Town officials commissioned local son Audley Dean Nicols for a painting that could be made into a poster to commemorate this great event in the history of Sewickley. The original painting has been lost, but the Historical Society has one of the original posters that was printed that September of 1911. By all accounts, the image of the three Native Americans admiring the new bridge was a huge hit among the local citizens. 60 years later in the Herald, editor B.G. Shields called it the most significant painting in the world to old Sewickley. Nicols, she said, symbolized the bridge opening to perfection. She added that because Nicols was lame, the climb up the cliffs on the other side of the river to gain the perspective in preparation for the bridge picture gained him admiration. Athletic contests were also held during that week-long opening celebration, and bronze medals were cast with Nicols' bridge image on them. Those medals were awarded to winners of the athletic contests, like the baseball game. So in 1911, Audley Dean Nicols, 36 years old, was an active, respected, well-liked bachelor in Sewickley society. And the following year, he began leaving town for months at a time. Most likely it was in 1912 that Nicols made his first trip to the Southwest, specifically to the desert outside Tucson, Arizona. This is one of Nicols' own photographs of the area where he was traveling. Now, today we don't think twice if somebody ducks out of the northern winters for the warm, dry desert air. But in 1912, tuberculosis sufferers were going in large numbers to the Southwest to find cures in the warmer, drier climate. And Nicols was a tuberculosis sufferer, or at least a survivor. But he didn't leave Sewickley in the heart of winter. He left just when spring is breaking over the Pennsylvania hills in late March, and he stayed away through April and May. And he didn't go to a tuberculosis sanatorium either, or even to a city where he could find comfortable lodging. No, instead, he launched out, as you can see from this picture, into the uninhabited desert. This probably raised some eyebrows in Sewickley. A writer in the Pittsburgh Index described how citizens of the day typically viewed Arizona. He wrote, "Those who have journeyed from the green hills of Western Pennsylvania to the burning deserts of Arizona have been disgusted at first with the monotony and absolute discomfort of the endless waste of sand and withered vegetation. It is the last place in the world one would expect to find an artist in search of inspiration." Now, for context, Arizona was the newest state in the Union then. It was admitted to the Union only in February of 1912. There were no paved roads in the state, only a few miles of gravel. Most roads were unimproved dirt, and past human settlement, which is where Nicols was headed, even the wagon tracks gave way to sheer dust and sand. Nicols, however, was not in the least daunted. This is the almost jocular description he gave to the Sewickley Herald about his trip to the Arizona desert in 1916. He said this, "And I wish you could have seen that automobile. We had 2 folding cots on the front guards, 2 suitcases, 3 2-gallon canteens, camp chairs, cooking utensils, food for 2 weeks and then some, a tarpaulin, cans of extra gas, my painting gear, and a wildcat kitten in a sugar bag. But the kitten got away. A cowpuncher who held us up for the makings said it was a shame to load down any automobile that way." In that year, Nicols' heavily weighted car got stuck in the sand. Fortunately, as you can see in this photo, a friendly rancher happened along and pulled out Nicols' car with a team of horses. Nicols knew how lucky he was on that trip. The following year, 1917, he told about passing the graves of 42 prospectors who died of thirst in the desert. He said, "And a number of those poor chaps had worn off the first joints of their fingers in their last struggle for water." He sounds rather cavalier, doesn't he? He does to me. And remember, this was a man who walked with a pronounced limp and whose health was less than robust. Yet each spring, beginning in 1912, he ventured into a place that he himself called the land of the survival of the fittest. And the fittest he was not. But Nicols was not a fool. Always, he had with him at least one companion familiar with the desert. Usually it was one or two of the Franciscan friars from a mission in Tucson. And early on, he began visiting the Native Americans of the region, the tribe he called the Papago, which we know today as the Tohono O'odham Nation. He admired these Native Americans and he learned from them. Still, these were not easy trips for any non-native, especially for a limping, less than robust person. Why did Audley Dean Nicols take the chances that he took? The reporter for the Pittsburgh Index claimed that in this article that you see, he claimed that it was a search for fresh material that sent Nicols to the arid regions of no man. He wrote in this article, "It was a desire to find something different from the conventional brooks and woodlands of the East that had been painted to tedium by landscape painters." But Nicols, as far as we know, had never painted a landscape in 1912 when he made his first trip to Arizona. Yes, he'd used landscapes as settings for human activity, like in his bridge painting or in The Fortune Teller, but he hadn't painted any landscapes per se. So was he looking for something different from the conventional brooks and woodlands of the East? Still, the search for fresh material could be a plausible explanation of his journeys in a larger sense. It had only been about 25 years since the railroads had opened the Southwest for travel. Especially in the East and the Midwest, there was a fascination in the 19 teens with anything Southwest, and not only the landscape. Also, the cowboy, Indian, and Mexican cultures there were capturing public attention. Perhaps Nicols went to Arizona thinking that just as he had painted people in the Northeast, he would paint the unique human cultures of the Southwest. Other artists were going to the Southwest to paint, artists like Dunton here and Joseph Henry Sharp, and sending their paintings back to New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago for a public hungry to see Southwest images. Nicols had likely seen some of their paintings. So perhaps he hoped that he could paint people pictures, as he had painted people pictures before, that would sell to this audience of buyers. After all, the demand for his magazine illustrations was continuing to dwindle as photographic reproduction got better and better. There was another pressure on him to sell paintings. His father had died in 1906 after a gruesome accident. His father caught his leg in an elevator at the People's Bank building in Pittsburgh. The leg had to be amputated, and then infection set in, and it took his life. That left Audley's mother with 3 sons at home, this in a day before pension plans and Social Security. And of course, Nicols had traveled before in search of health. The thought that he might feel better in the drier air of Arizona certainly didn't hamper his decision to make a painting trip there in 1912. So maybe all these practical reasons, the search for new material, the need for income, the search for better health, maybe all of those things nudged this well-liked, sociable painter of Sewickley to get on a train in early spring of 1912 and travel to the desert around Tucson to paint. Once there, though, something more than the practical struck Audley Dean Nicols. This man who had painted no landscapes probably fully expected to see what other Easterners saw in the desert, what the newspaper reporter described as the endless waste of sand and withered vegetation in the land that God forgot. But instead, Nicols was enraptured by the desert, and he waxed rhapsodic when he described it to the Sewickley Herald. He wrote to the Herald, "There are the clean, fresh blues in the skies, pinks and yellows in the sunsets, opalescent purple, rose, and lavender in the distant mountains, dull greens of every shade in the vegetation, and reds and yellows in the rocks and earth, but never gray. The desert is everything but gray." There was, he said, a call in the desert. Back in Sewickley, after his first trip in 1912, he painted his first desert landscape, and as he told the story, he sent it off to a dealer in Chicago. Charles W. Post, the breakfast cereal magnate, saw that painting in a Chicago shop window and bought it. This encouraged Nicols to paint another desert landscape, which he sent to a shop in Washington, D.C. And this is where the story takes a kind of fairy tale-like turn. There, strange to say, in a shop window in Washington, D.C., Mr. Post also saw it. He had a winter home in the capital, and he was said to frequent the art galleries of the city. Post bought that painting of Nicols too. And according to the story that Nicols told the Pittsburgh Index, from that sale on, he decided that the forlorn places of Arizona would be his subject matter. Nicols' desert canvases quickly began garnering attention and prestige. In January 1914, Pittsburgh's Wonderly Brothers Gallery mounted an exhibit that included drawings by the famous illustrator Charles Dana Gibson, 10 large canvases by N.C. Wyeth, and 1 large painting of an Arizona scene by Nicols. So the Sewickley artist was in esteemed painterly company. A year later, the Sewickley newspaper announced that 9 of Nicols' paintings would hang in the only special exhibition accepted that season at the Wonderly Galleries. 9 months later, in November of 1915, when this picture was painted, the gallery was displaying 19 of Nicols' works. Broadway stars and bank presidents were buying Nicols' canvases and paying $100 per square foot of canvas, a significant sum for the time. In the year 1917, when this scene was painted, Nicols sold 40 pictures. A Tucson newspaper wrote, "His paintings have created a vogue in Pittsburgh for Arizona landscapes." Between 1912 and the end of 1918, Nicols established a pattern that brought him, according to the Sewickley paper, great approval everywhere. In March, he would leave the Sewickley train station with a ticket for Tucson. For 2, 3, or 4 months, he would make expeditions in the desert to paint, but mostly to sketch. Back in Sewickley by early summer, Nicols would work through the rest of the year in his studio in the Trust Building, turning those sketches into paintings that conveyed the splendors he saw in the desert. The Wonderly Galleries and other shops sold these canvases to admirers around the country. And then the following March, Nicols would board the train bound for Tucson again. This cyclical pattern was serving Nicols very well, and he was about to upend it. With about 5,000 residents in 1918, Sewickley was a small town where people knew each other's doings. The weekly newspaper devoted a page to the In Society column, which reported who was a guest of whom, who was traveling where, and who had returned home. Nicols' trips to the Southwest were duly recorded, as you can see in the left-hand column there in the 4th item. Also, exhibits of his paintings at the Wonderly Brothers were recorded. And also the fact even that he judged the 1916 Sewickley Halloween parade. He was certainly a person of interest in town. But when he married Mary Mahoney, the Sewickley Herald made no mention of it. In fact, the paper's only mention of his marriage came 33 years later, when Mary Mahoney Nicols died in El Paso. In the marriage records of Richland County, Ohio, an elegant hand has inscribed that on October 5th, 1918, the probate judge officiated the union of Audley Dean Nicols, artist of Sewickley, Pennsylvania, and Mary Olivia Mahoney, housekeeper of Mansfield, Ohio. It's the last record on the second page there. 19 years younger than her husband, The bride was an Irish immigrant who, according to Nichols' grandson, Kent Morrison, worked as the upstairs maid in the family home on Beaver Street. 2 weeks later, the newspaper ran an obituary for Nichols' younger brother, Werner, who died in the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918. The obituary noted that surviving brothers, Audley and Lowell, lived at home with their mother. No mention of a wife. And then on December 11, 1918, a son, Audley Dean Jr., was born to Mr. and Mrs. Audley Nicols. And this too went publicly unacknowledged. It's possible the Nicholses managed to keep their life together a secret. More likely, perhaps, is that the small town arbiters regarded Audley Nicols' marriage and the birth of his son 9 weeks later as unseemly for an illustrious citizen. For all their interest in his earlier travels, the newspaper also said nothing of his departure from Sewickley with his new family. Sometime in the winter of 1919, Audley Dean Nicols stood on the platform of the Sewickley train station. 43 years old, he had a new wife and an infant son, and he was leaving the town his mother's family had called home for more than a century, a town where he had been a popular man about town. As his nephew, Captain Frederick Way Jr., later told the story, when the train pulled out of the station, Nichols threw his heavy overcoat onto the platform, dramatizing his intention to leave the cold of his hometown forever. Now, instead of taking the train to Tucson, as one might expect from his 7 years of painting trips there, and the hundreds of admirers he said to have had in Tucson, he and Mary settled in El Paso. This is a photograph of El Paso in 1920. Maybe Nichols feared the same sort of cold shoulder for his immigrant wife and new son in Tucson, where he was well known, as he'd gotten in Sewickley. Whatever the reason, they settled in El Paso, and within 3 years, they had built themselves a house of rocks at the edge of El Paso, where the city met the desert. Nichols had a studio, which you see here in that rock house. And just outside the house, beyond the house, Mount Franklin rose up in the desert. Nichols continued to paint the desert, including Mount Franklin, right outside his home. And he continued to travel to Arizona, as well as the deserts of Mexico and New Mexico, to sketch and to paint. Well, quickly it became known in El Paso that a talented painter had moved to town. Nichols sold his desert landscapes from the only art shop at the time in El Paso, where its owner, Harry Wagoner, became his friend and chief promoter. Nichols' paintings began selling so fast that he could barely keep up with the demand. He was painting 1 or 2 canvases a week to bring to the art shop to sell, sometimes before they were completely dry. And then Wagoner, the shop owner, would varnish them before they dried, and the canvases would crack all over and have to be sent out for restoration. That Nichols could paint 2 of his desert landscapes a week is remarkable when you look at the detail in them. Trained as an illustrator, he painted with an illustrator's precision to paint even small paintings. And this one is 16 by 24, a little larger than many of his paintings. To paint even small paintings with that kind of detail at the rate of 2 a week, well, it's no wonder that he became known in El Paso as a solitary artist. He had to, just to keep up with demand. This popular member of the younger Sewickley social set in El Paso was withdrawing into the desert and into his studio. But he wasn't a hermit or a recluse. Younger artists like Jose Aceves related how Nichols welcomed him into his studio, showing the young man how he got his characteristic color techniques. And Nichols went out camping and painting into the desert with Harry Wagoner, the art shop owner. And he had a whole circle of friends, like the commander of the army post in El Paso, with whom he loved to swap stories of the old Wild West. Rather than reclusive, in El Paso, Nichols rather became simply focused, devoted even to painting the desert, because the desert enthralled him. Art dealers, seeing how popular Nichols' paintings were becoming with buyers, urged younger artists to copy what they had begun to call the Nichols technique. That meant precise detail in the foreground, an expanse of shadowed desert floor with mountains in the background, sheathed in a kind of purple haze. These painters, the ones who were imitating Nichols, about 8 of them principally, became known as the Purple Mountain Painters, with Nichols as their acknowledged dean. Throughout the 1920s, Nichols truly was at his height as a painter of the Southwest desert. After 1920, he stopped sending his paintings out of El Paso for sale, which is a bit curious too, considering the close relationship he had with the Wonderly brothers in Pittsburgh. But it seems that once Nichols got to El Paso, he was no longer concerned with building a national reputation. Still, just by virtue of El Paso being a railroad hub, people from around the country were seeing and buying his canvases. In fact, though we couldn't find a record of it, a Nichols painting reputedly hung in the White House during the Harding administration of 1921 to 1923. Not only were sales of his exhibited paintings brisk, Nichols also began to receive commissions, large and small. Now, just as his bridge painting became the painting that immortalized him in Sewickley, in El Paso, there was a painting that immortalized him too, and it is a massive one. It is 16 by, I'm gonna go back so you can see the massiveness of it. This painting is 4 feet by 16 feet, and it was painted on commission for the lobby of the first mortgage company in El Paso. Just as for his bridge painting, for this one too, Nichols, the lame man, climbed to a high vantage point, a mesa where he could get a panoramic view of the city. View of El Paso at sunset, which is what this is called, hung in the lobby of the mortgage company until the company failed during the Depression. Then it hung in local hotels for a time, until the man who commissioned it donated it to El Paso High School. It hung in the high school until 1972 when it was sent out for restoration. And then for 28 years, it simply disappeared. It wasn't located. Now this is a painting that's 16 feet long and it disappeared for 28 years. In 1972, it was found again in a janitor's closet at El Paso High School. They must have very big janitor's closets in El Paso for it to be hidden away in one of those. But nonetheless, that happened. And the high school, realizing that they were not giving it its due, gave it on loan to the El Paso Museum of Art, where it has had a home ever since. After finishing that massive painting, in September of 1923, Nichols set out with his wife and son on a long road trip to Pennsylvania. It's the first time they'd been back to Sewickley since leaving 4 years earlier. The 2,800-mile drive took 2 weeks and 2 days, and Nichols told the Sewickley Herald that the 2-block stretch of Upper Broad Street approaching his mother's house was, he said, the roughest, bumpiest, and hardest on the car of any encountered in our trip. I wonder if he was speaking more about himself than the car, actually. In 1927, Nichols had another boost in his national reputation with this painting. It's called West Texas Wildflowers, and it won honorable mention in an art competition called the Texas Wildflower Competitive Exhibition. It was funded by a wealthy oil man, and that competition offered the largest cash prizes ever put up in an art competition in the US to that date. After the exhibition in San Antonio, the winning paintings, including Nicols' honorable mention, this one, were sent to New York City for exhibition, as well as to cities around Texas. The following year, in 1928, the competition was held again in San Antonio, and this time Nicols' entry, Texas Plains, won second place at a $1,000 award, which was a great sum for the time, a massive sum. This painting too was toured in New York City and Texas. And then in 1929, the following year, Nicols had another honorable mention in the last of the competitive exhibitions. Sometime after winning the second place award for this painting, Texas Plains, Nicols sent a print of that painting back to Sewickley to his nephew, Frederick Way Jr., with this inscription: "To one of my favorite people, Uncle Audley." You can see this framed print at the Sewickley Valley Historical Society. Perhaps because of his successes in the wildflower competition, Nicols got another major commission in 1929. That year, the president of the Texas and Pacific Railroad bought Nicols' painting of El Capitan, the highest peak in the Guadalupe mountain range. He proposed to Nicols and Joe Gandera, the new owner of the art shop in town, that they make the painting into a fine offset lithograph, 8 colors, and that they run 10,000 copies, which would then be distributed to railway ticket offices, tourist agencies, hotels, and other professional offices around the country. They wanted it to advertise the scenic beauties of the railroad's West Texas lines. Well, that surely helped to boost Nicols' national reputation as well. And also in that year, 1929, another prominent El Pasoan called on Nicols for a high-profile commission. Architect Henry Trost, who built the city's first skyscrapers in El Paso, he invited the painter to Douglas, Arizona. This is the main street there. The Gadsden Hotel, you can see it on the right there with the red striped awnings, which Trost had built in 1907, was swept by fire in February of 1928. The hotel owner, whiskey magnate Franklin Mackey, contracted with Trost to rebuild the hotel. And he said, "Spare no expense." Trost's rebuild of the hotel rose from the ashes in opulence. A lobby with Italian tiled floors, Italian marble staircase and columns, and excuse me, a 14-karat gold leaf ceiling with vaulted 28-foot skylights of stained glass. To crown the grand staircase, Trost asked Nicols to design a stained glass mural that would be crafted by a Tiffany-trained glass master. You can see it there. And then Nicols also painted a 6 by 7 foot painting in the lunette embedded there in the glass mural. Nicols painted the canvas on scene in 1929. It's a picture of cowboys and their wagons moving cattle across the desert against a backdrop of his signature hazy purple mountains. Nicols sent a photograph of this painting back to Sewickley to his friend A.C. Walker, which the Sewickley Herald got a hold of and printed on the front page. They added the caption that said, "Audley Dean Nicols, formerly of Sewickley, has made an international reputation as an artist through his paintings of desert scenes." By the end of the 1920s, Nicols truly was at his height as an artist. The capstone was his election, announced in January of 1931, to something called the Southern National Academy. It was an exclusive society of artists Membership was capped at 25, and those chosen became members for life. Nicols was very proud of his Academy status and thereafter signed his paintings Audley Dean Nicols, SNA, standing for Southern National Academy. Well, just as Nicols reached the height of his artistic reputation, the Great Depression hit the country. We don't know how much, if any, financial pressure Nicols felt. Perhaps enough wealthy patrons were still buying enough paintings to keep his family comfortable. Perhaps the artist had put money away while his paintings were selling faster than he could paint them. But most probably the sale of his paintings slowed. The Sewickley newspaper actually hints at that. In March of 1931, right after his election to the Southern National Academy, the paper reported that Nicols had sent canvases back home to his brother Lowell. It's the first mention of him sending paintings back home to Sewickley since his departure 12 years earlier. The reporter described in glowing detail 2 Arizona landscapes that were displayed in the window of Walker's Drug. That's the store you can see on the right there. Shortly after that, in June of 1931, Lowell, his brother, was advertising Desert Landscapes, Paintings in Oil by Audley Dean Nicols, SNA, for sale in the newspaper's classified ads. You can see on the left, the third item down. This artist, who had won prizes, whose work had been displayed in New York City and museums across Texas, was now showing paintings in a drugstore window, paintings which his brother sold through a small town paper's classified ads. Financial need may well have accounted for this arrangement between the artist and his hometown. It's an arrangement that continued for at least the next 2 years. Into this uncertain financial situation, Mary Nicols gave birth to the couple's second child, a daughter, Mary Elizabeth, in July of 1931. Then, almost exactly a year later, an even greater uncertainty than the Depression clouded the Nicols household. On Friday, August 12, 1932, Nicols was at home when, as he described it, the lights went out. Doctors diagnosed a brain hemorrhage, a type of stroke. In Sewickley, Lowell Nicols received a telegram late that night, as this article describes. Driving to Pittsburgh, Lowell caught a train to Chicago, then in turbulent weather, a plane to El Paso. Once he got to El Paso, though, he reported finding his brother had rallied satisfactorily, according to this article. He told the Herald that Audley was able to use his paintbrush as before and seemed likely to continue his usual pursuits as an artist in about his former state of health. And then he went on to give the Herald a long account of the stormy plane ride, because plane rides, any plane ride, was quite a novelty in 1932. The artist himself had a similar optimistic outlook for his recovery. Interviewed at home in bed 3 weeks after the stroke, Nicols told the El Paso Times that he felt lucky to have come out of his illness with his faculties unimpaired. Alas, that was not to be the case. Eugene Thurston, a younger El Paso artist who admired and tried to imitate Nicols, related that after the stroke, Nicols couldn't control his hands. He couldn't paint in the precise way that he had painted before. He tried, but he couldn't, and in his frustration, he would smash canvases. Nicols' daughter, Mary Beth, remembers the same. She remembers that she and her mother, Mary Nicols, would try to salvage paintings that Nicols had thrown into the trash because he was so frustrated with them. For the book, we could find only one painting that was definitely made after Nicols' stroke. It's a painting done for Stephen F. Austin High School in El Paso under the New Deal's Public Works of Art project. Dated 1935, it's clear that this painting lacks the color subtlety and the motor control of his earlier work. This may well be Nicols' last artistic effort. It's the last and the latest painting that we found anyway. Physiologically and psychologically, the stroke set in motion Nicols' demise. The popular and charming bachelor in Sewickley's social set became more and more solitary in El Paso, in devotion to conveying the splendors he saw and felt in the desert. And when he could no longer do that, convey those splendors in paint, when he could no longer do that, he became more and more isolated, as any sick person does. His last years were spent close in the home, according to the El Paso Herald Post, looking out on the mountains and the El Paso Mesa and Valley. On November 13, 1941, 9 years after the stroke that essentially ended his painting career, Audley Dean Nicols died at home in the rock house that he and Mary built at the base of Mount Franklin. He was 66 years old. The El Paso paper, in its obituary, called the artist naturally reserved, with the personal qualities of a mystic. I have to wonder if the people of Sewickley, the people who knew him in Sewickley, would have recognized him in that description, naturally reserved, with the personal qualities of a mystic. The mystic in Nicols was evoked by the desert, by the light that he called a revelation to Pittsburgh eyes. He had never seen such colors and forms as those that materialized for him in the mountains and mesas, the canyons and valleys of the Southwest desert. He felt compelled to paint the beauty revealed to him there. That calling became his whole life. And when he could no longer do it, life ebbed from him. In honor of the Purple Mountain Painter's dean, the artist of El Paso attended Nicols' funeral as a body. Texas art historian Carol Ann Price writes that Nicols established a distinctive style of photographic realism in the depiction of Southwestern landscapes. She summarizes, in all probability, Nicols did more than anyone else in El Paso to create a greater awareness of and interest in Southwestern art. She names him the great pioneer of Southwestern art. In perhaps a revisionist twist, the Sewickley Herald, in its obituary for Nicols, noted this: the artist's removal to the dry air of Texas was advised by his doctors. He went reluctantly, but became greatly captivated with the great stretches of desert scenery in that vicinity, and he painted it with success. Whether Nicols did indeed leave the place of his birth and the town that his family had helped to found reluctantly or not, he certainly did become captivated with the desert and with the mission of offering the beauty that captivated him there to others. Thank you for joining us on this abbreviated tour of Audley Dean Nicols. If you've enjoyed it, you can find more stories about Nicols and many paintings, many more paintings in our soon-to-be published book, Everything But Gray, The Life of Audley Dean Nicols. The book is available for pre-order on our website, thelifeofaudleydeannicols.com, and you can also find that link on the website of the Historical Society. So thank you, Amanda and the Historical Society for this invitation to talk about a subject that both Tom and I have become enamored with. And thank you to all of you who attended, both in person and online, for your very generous attention. It means the world to us. I'm going to turn it back to Amanda.
Oh, I was just going to say, Gayle, what a wonderful presenter you are. I cannot wait to read the words that you have put in print. You're a wonderful presenter.
Thank you. Here's a little hint. I used to teach public speaking, so if I can't do it, I sure shouldn't have been teaching it.
Thank you again, Gayle and Tom, for this magnificent assemblage of this tremendous art, which we had no idea, at least I didn't, and I'm sure most of our audience did not realize the depth and the absolute beauty of these Nicols paintings. Did anyone in the audience have a question for our speakers this
I have something I would like to show everyone. And I thank Gayle and Tom for including so much information about Audley Dean Nicols' life in Sewickley. And this is one of two paintings. It's rather dark. The other one I have is much larger. It's about 2 feet by 3 feet. And I'm sorry I didn't take it off the wall to bring it in. But this painting and the other one were done by Elizabeth McLaughlin, the mother and the teacher of Audley Dean Nicols. And I purchased both of them at her grandson's auction. So at Captain Way's auction. So this was one of two paintings. And it's interesting what you said about landscapes and that he didn't do landscapes when he lived in Sewickley. And that may be because his mother did so many landscapes. And of course, she had studied under the great George Hetzel. But this is supposed to be, neither of these paintings are signed, but they have a pretty good provenance because they come from Captain Way. And at the auction, all of the local dealers, including John Crack, Roy Egan, they all wanted these two paintings. And they said, all right, Mary Beth, we'll let you have them and we won't bid against you, but you have to take really good care of them. So I took that to heart and I sent both of them to New York to be conserved. But this is supposed to be the Beaver Road in Sewickley before the white man appeared. And there is a large tree here that is supposedly still standing just west of the Presbyterian Church across from Pine Road. And the other painting, you're welcome to stop at my house and have a look at it. And it's Little Sewickley Creek.
Are they dated? Are the paintings dated?
No, they are not. But Marty O'Brien, who's seated behind me and who really is the art expert here, was looking at it. And you said you thought maybe 1880s. And also you mentioned so much about the Wonderly brothers. And there is a sticker on the back of the frame. So this was also sold at or framed by the Wonderly brothers. So thank you for letting me share.
Yeah, thank you very much. We had no idea that his mother was, I'd be curious to know about the date, whether she was painting after she had children or if that was painted while she was still unmarried and teaching drawing and painting.
I don't know, and I guess I could try to research more about that. I know she was a contemporary of Agnes Way, who was also related to Captain Way. They were about the same age. And Agnes Way was a very prolific painter, and she lived for a very long time. Also, the McLaughlin family, I've done some research, and I'm on the history committee of the Presbyterian Church. And I believe that Elizabeth McLaughlin's father was one of the very first Presbyterians in Sewickley at the very beginning of the 1800s. And that was before the church was formally established.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions or any other comments from the audience or anyone on Zoom this evening?
You know, his teachers were at the art students with?
Did you hear that, Gayle?
No.
Marty, come up to the mic here.
So Gayle, could you stop sharing your screen? We're seeing the black end of the slideshow.
Oh, sure. I'm sorry.
Okay, I was trying to turn it off on my end, but it didn't want to.
There we go.
My question was, do we know who his teacher was at the Art Students League or teachers at the Art Students League in New York?
Yes, we know that there were at least 3 of them. Kenyon Cox was one of them. Oh, where's my manuscript? You'll have to read it in the book. They're in the book, but the names escape me. Right, there were 3 prominent teachers at the Art Students League. The name that I recall is Kenyon Cox, because Kenyon Cox was also on the jury of the Carnegie exhibition the year that his painting was accepted into the Carnegie exhibition.
I think that's interesting because I believe we have a painting that Kenyon Cox did of.
We have the portrait of William Anderson Coffin by Kenyon Cox. It was done here in Western Pennsylvania. Coffin was also an art critic and teacher in New York.
Yes.
Area. Yeah.
Right. Another name now that comes to me is the last name is Blashfield, who was apparently a muralist. And the third name I'm forgetting, but he studied with Kenyon Cox, Mr. Blashfield, and there was a third that was mentioned. I mentioned in the book too, I didn't mention it tonight, that a number of sources we found said that Audley Nicols studied in Europe, but we could find no evidence of that. And Nicols himself never mentioned it when he talked about his background and his coming to be a painter in the few interviews that he gave. He never mentioned Europe, but a number of the sources, I think it got mentioned once and then just repeated like a game of telephone. It gets repeated and muddled. So I don't believe that he ever did study in Europe.
Well, again, thank you very much, Gayle. Tom, I would like to extend an invitation for you to bring your collection to Sewickley, and we'll partner with the Sweetwater Center for the Arts and hold an exposition for you.
Field trip to Sewickley.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Gayle and Thomas. We so look forward to the book and hope to have it for Christmas gifts to give to others as well as keeping for ourselves. So thank you. Really
You'll
look
have it,
forward to
Doug. You'll have it.
Yes, and thank you, Doug, for giving us permission to reproduce your beautiful paintings in the book. They really add to the book.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm going to study them when I get home tonight. I'm going to study them more closely with much greater appreciation with this presentation.
He was a remarkable man.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Okay. Good night. We'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you.
Everyone would like to help themselves to refreshments in the lobby. Katie and Ian Semple and the Lager House Bakery are providing refreshments for us this evening. Thank you.